12 years ago, I concluded a book that I published with the warning that the West was headed for the abyss. About 3 years ago, I started warning my friends in conversation on social media that the United States was drifting towards civil war. About a year ago, I posted a video on this channel making the same warning, and I'll link to it below. And then about 3 weeks ago, I posted another video saying that we were getting even closer to civil war, and I'll post a link to that below as well. What I want to do in this video is to not warn that we're drifting towards civil war, but to alert people to the fact that the civil war has begun. Let me repeat that. A new American civil war has begun. If you ask Americans, the ones who know anything about the American Civil War, when it began, they'll usually say April 1861, which was when Confederacy started the bombardment of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. But if you're familiar with Alan Nevin's great 8-volume history of the Civil War, of your deal with the Union, he doesn't get up to that point until volume 3. The first 2 volumes are spent on the period before 1861, which he sees as the drift toward civil war. In fact, Nevins begins his history of the Civil War with the American victory in Mexico, in Chapultepec, when we defeated Mexico in the Mexican-American War in 1848. After that, as the Americans tried to deal with that victory in a political sense and the expansion into the South of the Federal Union, you had failed compromises. You had the disastrous compromises of 1850. You had the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which undid the Missouri Compromise, which set off all kinds of alarm bells, especially in the North. It was the Kansas-Nebraska Act / compromise that led to the rise and quickly developing prominence of the Republican Party. You had all the things that went along the way. You had Bloody Kansas, basically open civil war in Kansas with massacres by the slave group at Lawrence and the Potawatomi massacres from the Unionist group, the non-slave group. You had the Dred Scott decision. You had the John Brown raid. You had all these other things, including in 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln, which wasn't just, it was a lot more than that, because you have to understand the Republican Party, which had not existed before the Kansas-Nebraska Act, by 1858 had taken control of the House of Representatives, and in 1860 didn't just take the presidency under Abraham Lincoln, but it also took the Senate. So by 1860, this Republican Party, which had not existed 6 years before, controlled all the levers of power in the federal government, except for obviously the Supreme Court. And what you had after that was the Confederate States, one by one, start leaving the Union. And their Democratic-controlled governments did nothing to stop it. There were a few instances in North Carolina and western parts of Virginia and in Texas, where even Sam Houston tried to oppose it, but to no avail. So one by one, the Confederate States left. Most before Fort Sumter, a couple of them after Fort Sumter, most notably Virginia and I think North Carolina. So this was a long drift towards civil war. It wasn't something that happened, in one blow. And you have to understand that to understand what it means to have civil war. It's not when the first shot's fired. It's how do you get to the point that shots are getting fired. And that we're still at the point where shots, well, in some cases, shots are being fired today. But we're still at that point. Now, the main thing driving this drift towards civil war is the loss of consensus in the country. And I've talked about that in the 2 previous videos that I've linked to below. But there are a couple of aspects of that I want to go over again. I mean, I think one of the most visible things, which looks like the drift toward the Civil War, over a century ago, is these ideas of these sanctuary cities, where you have cities, counties, and an entire state saying that, we're not going to work with the federal government to apply immigration law. This is I'm not saying this is a cause of civil war, but this is a symptom of civil war. It's akin to what was happening, back in the days before the Civil War, as the southern states started to leave the Union. And the Democrats who controlled those states did very little, close to nothing, to prevent that from happening. And the same thing's being done today. Beyond that, you have the more immediate problems that we're seeing, the breakdown of control in, again, Democrat-controlled cities, whether it's Minneapolis or Seattle or Atlanta and Chicago. You're seeing not just protesting, that's not the issue. It's when the protests devolve into rioting, looting, and arson. And now we're at the point in Seattle where for weeks now we've had this autonomous zone, whatever you want to call it, sitting out there. You have a mayor who last Wednesday said that's it, she's had enough, she's getting rid of it, and it's still there. It's going to be a week in 48 hours almost, and it's still there, and things are still going off the rails. And what's she doing? And what are the Democrats doing in general about what's happening? Not the protests, but the looting and the arson. Are they speaking out against it? No. They seem to actually be encouraging it. And you have, BLM basically shaking down corporations for money. Everybody has to take a knee. And all this stuff is going on, and nobody's doing anything, much of anything, to stop it. I mean, even where are the Republicans? I mean, they're even just sitting on their hands, watching all this happen, afraid to say anything, because if they do, they're going to be declared as racist, and nobody wants to be called a racist. That the only person who's doing anything, and that's insufficient so far, is the president, Donald Trump. So what we have is these forces growing in the country, seemingly unstoppable, gaining momentum. And nobody seems to want to do anything about it. At this point, I would argue that we're already in a civil war, and it's a one-sided civil war. It's built up all this momentum. Is momentum going to run itself out? When's it going to stop? Is it going to stop? If the Republicans are unwilling to take action, or slow to take action, and the Democrats have no interest in taking action because they see these developments as something that they believe will help them politically in November. I doubt very much that it will, but that's what they're hoping, because they don't know what else to do because they got such a crappy candidate in Joe Biden. Nothing's going to stop this momentum. In fact, actions are being taken by Democrats to actually maintain the momentum. They're basically neutering the police that they control, withdrawing them from places, allowing stores to be looted, burnt down. They're not doing anything to prevent that. They want to defund the police. In some places, they want to dismantle the police forces. So far from taking action, basically what they're attempting to do is allow this to continue, allow it to continue to gain momentum through their own inaction. And they're doing everything they can do to keep this thing going, because they see it as something that will be advantageous to them politically. I've long said, that every political action has an equal and opposite reaction. So while our political leaders may not be taking action, people are. And in ways that, in hindsight, I think we'll consider dangerous. If you read the papers, you know what's going on. People are buying guns. People are stocking up on ammunition. I think the gun sales in Illinois, which is a blue state, are up 500%. Why is that? Why do so many people want to go and purchase a firearm? It's because basically the Democrats, who in the gun control debate have been saying for years, you don't need a gun to protect yourself. That's what the police are for. But now what they're telling us, not just telling us, demonstrating to us, is that the police will not protect you. That if looters come to get your store, they're not going to do anything to stop them. They'll actually withdraw and allow the place to be looted or burned down. And what do you think people are going to do? They're going to buy weapons. They're going to protect themselves. We've seen instances of that in riots going, at least back to 1992 with the roof Koreans, trying to protect their property because the police weren't going to do it. And that's what you're seeing Americans doing. Each month we're setting new records for, requests for permits, background checks, and things like that. This country is arming. And if you go back to the American Civil War, in the years before that, you'll see that same thing going on. It was the rebirth of militias, which had kind of died out after the Revolutionary period, after the War of 1812, start flourishing again in the United States, mostly in the North, but also, mostly in the South, excuse me, but also in the North. This rebirth of the militia movements, you had in New York, you had the Zouaves with their fancy uniforms, and in the South you had all these people, and they were arming up, not just with sidearms, not just with army-style muskets. In some cases they had cavalry units and cannon and artillery. I mean, this was dangerous, but this is why when the Civil War began, there were so many armed forces available to both the North and the South. They're not all regular units. In fact, the South had no regular units. There were a handful of regular units that were available, regular regiments available to the Union Army. But most of all these are volunteers. And where were these volunteers coming from who knew at least something about military life and how to use firearms? From all these volunteer militia units which were springing up in the years before the American Civil War, because people inherently understood that was the drift that we were caught in. We were heading in that direction. What we're also seeing, but just very beginnings of it at this point, are private citizens, groups of private citizens, defending themselves or defending their own interests. You do see people gathering together in Chicago during the riots. You actually had Latino gangs protecting Latino neighborhoods and shops and stores from African American looters coming in from other districts in Chicago. We know about that. We heard about that in the infamous tape of the alderman meeting with the mayor virtually when that came up. We know that was happening in Chicago. In Philadelphia recently, there was fear of an attack when a Christopher Columbus statue and a bunch of Italian Americans, probably armed, went down there and gathered to protect that statue. And it's happened in a few other places. I recently saw a video of Albuquerque, New Mexico, where one of these, in the media, they're called right-wing, racist, white supremacist groups. But actually, if you look at the video of the group, there's one of the main speakers, leaders in the group, seems to be an African American, and there's another guy who looks maybe South Asian in the group. They're not all white, and they're obviously not white supremacists. And they're gathering, and they're armed, and they have a spokesperson, and they're out there to try to talk these people down from going after something or other. And what's really interesting is that they're coordinating with the police. So this is going on in the country as well. And of course, the media doesn't want to look at that. They just wanted to say that these white supremacist groups that are causing problems out there. But God knows what's going on in other areas. I've heard stories. I'm from Philadelphia, and I get information sometimes from the city, but there are other neighborhoods where similar things are happening. And it's probably happening all over the country. We're just not aware of it because it's not the kind of thing the media wants to report on. But these are dangerous signs. Again, when you have basically officials, mostly Democrats, telling us that we will not protect you, demonstrating to us in city after city that we will not protect you if somebody threatens your life or property. What do they think is going to happen? People will look to defend their own life and property if the police aren't going to do it for them. And while I know there's people who think the police are out of control and they're racist and they're this, that, and the other thing and they're poorly trained, remember George Zimmerman. The alternative to being defended by a police force is to be defended by George Zimmerman. And these groups that will form up, vigilance committees, which gives us the word vigilante, are going to be more poorly trained than the police. Nobody's going to be screening them for, possible racism or psychological problems or psychiatric problems for that matter. And what kind of result do you think you're going to get? I mean, it's these vigilance committees that used to lynch people. I mean, there were white vigilance committees in the South that would lynch African Americans. I mean, what is lynching? Not just, killing an African American. Lynching is not operating within the legal system. So when you pull the police component out of the legal system, and people think there'll be no justice, they'll take justice in their own hands. That's vigilantism. Do we really want to go there? Do you want, predominantly white or Hispanic neighborhoods protecting themselves against black intruders? You think you're going to get a controlled reaction there by well-trained people who've been screened for racism? I mean, this is absurd. But this is the road they put us on. Just as the Democrats put us on the road to Fort Sumter by not taking action to prevent these militias from popping up in the South, to prevent southern states from leaving the Union, we're in the same position we are now. We are drifting into civil war. And in many ways, I would argue it's already begun. The shooting has started. What hasn't happened yet, just as in the American Civil War didn't start till after Fort Sumter, is to have the other side start shooting back. And once that happens, and we may not be far from it, we're going to be in big trouble. Now, what's the spark to set this up? And this is something that if you look at my other two videos, I never could quite come to grips with. I didn't know what the spark would be that would set the whole thing off. I'm beginning to think it may be just as it was in 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln. It may be in 2020, the election or re-election of Donald Trump, or the failed re-election of Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is re-elected, what the hell is the left going to do this time? Are they going to back off and say, well, we pulled out all the stops and lost, so let's just calm down? Or are they going to keep going after Trump and keep stoking the pressure, keep up this resistance, out in the streets with protests and everything else, and keep generating this kind of reaction? If they do that for 4 more years, we probably will just go into full-blown civil war. Alternatively, if Trump loses and the Democrats win and the progressives take over, if they control the House and the Senate, it may set it off as well, because God knows what they'll do when they get all this power. If they look at what they're doing now without political power, without the presidency, without the Senate. Look at what they're doing in the school systems, in the cities that they control, in the states that they control. What are they going to do if they control all the levers of power in the nation? Maybe even stack the Supreme Court and just start pushing through all the things we're seeing now in parts of the country, in the entire country. God knows what's going to happen. So this election, no matter who wins, may well plunge us into civil war. And I guess that's my warning in this video. The civil war has already begun. Right now, it's a one-sided effort. But I think pretty soon, increasingly, unless the Democrats back off, which I don't think that they will. I don't think that they can at this point. We are headed into full-blown civil war. But when people look back, the things we're seeing now will be seen as the triggers and the sparks that led us to that full-blown civil war. And when that happens, God save us all, because it's going to be ugly. It's going to make our previous civil war look like child's play, because we're so much more divided today than we are then. There were a lot of things, as I said in the last video I posted on YouTube, there are still a lot of things, most things in the American Civil War united Americans. Slavery divided us. Tariffs divided us. A handful of other things. But, philosophically, in terms of economics, politics, there was still a consensus in this country. That consensus is gone. There is no consensus today on anything. Not even being an American. Not even what it means to be an American. There's no consensus. The consensus has been destroyed by the left in this country. There's nothing holding this country together except inertia. And they seem intent on ensuring that that inertia is destroyed as well. And when it is, all hell's going to break loose. If you like this video, leave a comment. Please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification button so you know when I post new videos. And until the next time, to paraphrase or quote Dennis Miller, I am out of here.